The watchful eyes of Maple Street. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Maple Street was a place where routine was cherished and the unfamiliar was met with curiosity. Every home had its rhythm, mornings filled with the sounds of school buses and coffee brewing, and evenings marked by the steady hum of lawnmowers or children playing in the streets. It was a neighborhood where everyone felt they knew each other, where life had a certain predictability that brought comfort. But for Miriam Hughes, that comfort had recently been interrupted by a growing sense of unease. At 75, Miriam had lived on Maple Street longer than most of her neighbors. A widow of 10 years, she had settled into a predictable routine of her own. Mornings spent in her garden, tending to roses, afternoons spent knitting or reading by the window, and evenings at the local community center. Her life was quiet, but that was how she liked it. She had seen enough of the world's chaos and heartache in her younger years to appreciate the stillness of her twilight years. However, something had shifted. It started about 2 months ago when Miriam noticed an unfamiliar black car, a sleek, polished vehicle that stood out against the practical minivans and economy cars of Maple Street. The car would glide down the road, its headlights reflecting off the pavement, and it would park in front of the dilapidated garage at the very end of the block. The garage had been abandoned for years, its paint chipped, the roof sagging slightly from neglect. It was an eyesore, but one that had faded into the background of everyday life. No one used it, no one visited it, and certainly no one had lived there for as long as Miriam could remember. Yet now, every evening just before dusk, the car would arrive. The driver was a man, middle-aged, perhaps in his early 40s, with dark hair and an air of quiet authority. Miriam had seen him before, though it had been many years. James Donovan, once a prominent figure in the community, had grown distant, almost reclusive, after his wife's tragic death in a car accident 5 years ago. He was a wealthy businessman, known for his philanthropy and generous contributions to the local schools and shelters. But after the accident, he disappeared from public life, retreating to his mansion on the outskirts of town. Beside James, in the passenger seat, was a girl. She was young, perhaps no older than 8 or 9, her skin a deep warm brown, her eyes large and curious, always watching the world from behind the safety of the car window. She wore simple clothes, a yellow dress, which seemed too bright and cheerful for the setting. Miriam had never seen this girl before, and the mystery gnawed at her. Who was she? Why was she with James? And what on earth were they doing at that old garage night after night? Miriam's curiosity quickly turned to concern. For the first few nights, she told herself it was nothing, just a businessman handling some private matter. But as the days turned into weeks and the visits became routine, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why would a millionaire, with all his resources, bring a child to such a rundown place every night? And why did they stay so long, only leaving when the first light of dawn crept over the horizon? One particularly warm evening in late summer, Miriam decided she needed answers. She had always been a sharp woman, quick to notice things others overlooked. Her late husband used to joke that nothing got past Miriam Hughes, and it was a reputation she wore proudly. So she took up a new routine, sitting by her window every evening, watching as the black car made its way down Maple Street, slowing to a stop in front of the garage. From her vantage point, Miriam observed James closely. He moved with a purpose, always opening the car door for the girl, ushering her inside the garage before anyone could get a good look. The girl, for her part, never seemed frightened or upset, but there was a quietness to her that disturbed Miriam. She didn't run or skip like most children her age. She simply followed James inside the garage, her eyes downcast, her steps measured. On the rare occasions when Miriam caught a glimpse of the girl's face, she saw something that deepened her concern, an exhaustion, a heaviness in her eyes that no child should bear. It was as if the girl carried the weight of something far beyond her years, and it tugged at Miriam's heart. Whatever was happening inside that garage, it couldn't be good. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Miriam began to make excuses to be outside when James arrived. She would water her flowers, even when they didn't need it. She'd check the mail long after the postman had come and gone. Sometimes she would simply stand at her gate, pretending to enjoy the evening air. But no matter how hard she tried, she never managed to catch James off guard. He was careful, always scanning the street, making sure no one was watching before disappearing into the shadows of the garage with the girl. As the days passed, Miriam's concern grew into a quiet obsession. She started keeping a notebook, jotting down the exact times James arrived and left, noting any small changes in his routine. The more she observed, the more questions she had. Why did they never bring anything with them? No food, no luggage, nothing that suggested they were staying for any length of time. And why did they always leave so early in the morning, just as the rest of the neighborhood was waking up? It wasn't long before the other neighbors started to notice Miriam's increased vigilance. Mrs. Harris from next door commented on how often she saw Miriam outside these days, and Tom Jenkins, from across the street, made a joke about Miriam taking up late-night bird watching. Miriam laughed it off, but inside, her anxiety was building. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and that it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Then, one night, everything changed. It was a particularly stormy evening, the kind where the rain falls in sheets and the wind howls through the trees. Miriam had just settled into her usual spot by the window when she saw the familiar headlights of James's car cutting through the downpour. But this time, something was different. The car pulled up in front of the garage as usual, but instead of getting out immediately, James sat there for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. Miriam could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands gripped the wheel as if he were trying to gather his thoughts. And then, for the first time since she had started watching, the girl opened the door and stepped out on her own. She stood in the rain, her yellow dress clinging to her small frame, her hair slicked against her forehead. She looked up at James, who still hadn't moved, and for a brief moment, their eyes met in the rearview mirror. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. Something was happening, something important. The air was thick with tension, and even from her window, Miriam could feel the weight of it. She leaned forward, her breath fogging the glass as she waited to see what would happen next. James finally stepped out of the car, walking around to where the girl stood. He knelt down, his face close to hers, and though Miriam couldn't hear what he was saying, she saw the girl nod slowly. James reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, and together, they walked into the garage. As the door creaked shut behind them, Miriam sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. And whatever it was going to change everything. This was just the beginning. The quiet streets of Maple Street would soon be rocked by revelations that no one could have predicted, and Miriam Hughes would find herself at the center of it all, drawn into a mystery far deeper and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. A veil of secrets. The next morning, the rain had subsided, leaving Maple Street drenched in the shimmering glow of dawn. Miriam woke early, her mind still racing from the events of the previous night. She hadn't slept much, the tension in her chest lingering well after the storm had passed. She had always been an early riser, but today she felt driven by something more. A compulsion, a need to understand what was happening with James Donovan and the mysterious girl. As she sipped her morning tea, she peered out her window, hoping for any sign of movement from the old garage. But as usual, by the time the first light of day touched the streets, the black car was gone. The garage stood silent and empty, its once bright red paint now peeling away, revealing the decay beneath. It was a ghost of what it had once been, much like the secrets it now harbored. Determined to know more, Miriam decided it was time to take a bolder step. She could no longer sit idly by, watching from the safety of her window. Something gnawed at her, an instinct that refused to be silenced. She knew the longer she waited, the deeper this mystery would grow. So, she wrapped herself in her light coat and grabbed her walking stick. The morning air was crisp, and the world was still asleep, but Miriam had a plan. She would pay a visit to the one person in the neighborhood who knew more about everyone than they knew about themselves. Mrs. Abigail Thompson. Abigail, or Abby, as most called her, was Maple Street's unofficial historian, gossip-monger, and keeper of secrets. If there was anything to know about James Donovan or the little girl, Abigail would surely have heard something. Miriam walked the short distance to Abigail's house, her footsteps soft against the damp pavement. The large oak trees that lined the street were still dripping from the rain, their leaves shimmering in the early light. As she approached Abigail's home, she hesitated for a moment, wondering how much she should reveal. But she pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about idle gossip. This was about protecting a child. With renewed determination, she rang the doorbell. The door creaked open almost immediately, as if Abigail had been waiting for something or someone. "Miriam, darling," Abigail exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with genuine surprise. She was a tall woman, elegant despite her age, with sharp blue eyes that never missed a detail. "What brings you here so early?" "Morning, Abby. I'm sorry to drop by unannounced," Miriam said with a warm but distracted smile. "I just wanted to talk to you about something that's been on my mind lately." Abigail's expression shifted from one of surprise to curiosity. She ushered Miriam inside, leading her to the cozy living room filled with overstuffed armchairs, framed photographs, and the faint smell of lavender. Come in, come in. I was just about to make another pot of tea." Miriam settled into a chair by the window as Abigail bustled about the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed tea filled the room, and Miriam took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. This was no ordinary conversation she was about to have. As soon as Abigail returned with 2 cups of tea, Miriam cut straight to the point. "Abby, do you know anything about James Donovan? I mean, what he's been up to recently?" Abigail raised an eyebrow, sipping her tea slowly. "James Donovan. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while," she mused, setting her cup down. "He's been rather reclusive ever since his wife passed, bless her soul, but recently." "No, not much. Why do you ask?" Miriam hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "He's been coming by the old garage at the end of the street every night, and there's a girl with him, a young girl, probably no older than 9 or 10. They go in and stay until morning. It's strange, Abby. I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." Abigail's eyes widened, her interest clearly piqued. She sat up straighter, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. "A girl, you say? Well, that's certainly news to me. I thought he didn't have any family left, especially not a child. And the old garage, why on earth would he be going there?" "I don't know," Miriam admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "That's what I've been trying to figure out, but it doesn't sit right with me. I've been watching them for weeks now, and it just seems so secretive." Abigail's gaze softened, and she nodded thoughtfully. "I can see why you're concerned. James has always been a private man, but this is different. I'll ask around, see if anyone else has noticed anything unusual." Miriam thanked her, feeling a small sense of relief that someone else was now aware of the situation. As they finished their tea, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, old memories of the neighborhood, the latest developments in town. But Miriam's mind was still turning over the mystery of the black car, the girl, and the abandoned garage. As she left Abigail's house, Miriam felt a sense of urgency building within her. She needed answers, and soon. The longer this dragged on, the more she feared for the girl's safety. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Maple Street, Miriam found herself back at her window, her eyes trained on the old garage. She had told herself she wouldn't get too involved, that she would wait for Abigail to gather more information before making any rash decisions. But her instincts wouldn't let her rest. When the black car arrived once again, Miriam felt a surge of determination. Tonight, She wouldn't just watch, she would act. She slipped out of her house, the cool night air biting at her skin, and made her way quietly down the street, careful to stay in the shadows. As she approached the garage, she could see James and the girl standing by the car. The girl's face was illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp, and for the first time, Miriam could see her clearly. There was a sadness in her eyes that broke Miriam's heart. She watched as James unlocked the garage door and led the girl inside. Miriam waited until the door closed before stepping closer. Her pulse raced as she reached the side of the garage. She pressed her ear to the cold, cracked wood, straining to hear any sound from within. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then, faintly, she heard the murmur of voices, James speaking in a low, gentle tone, and the girl responding softly. Miriam held her breath, her mind racing. What were they talking about? Was the girl in danger? Before she could decide her next move, she heard something that sent a chill down her spine. A cry, soft at first, then growing louder. It was the girl, sobbing. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't stand by any longer. She had to know what was happening inside. Taking a deep breath, she stepped around to the front of the garage, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. It was locked. She stepped back, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Should she call the police? But what would she tell them? That she had been spying on her neighbor and suspected something was wrong. She had no proof, nothing concrete to back up her claims. But the sound of the girl's cries haunted her. She couldn't just walk away. As she stood there, torn between her instincts and her fear, the garage door suddenly creaked open. Miriam froze, her breath catching in her throat. James stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. He looked down at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miriam," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing here?" Miriam's mind raced, searching for an excuse. But before she could speak, the sound of the girl's soft sobs reached her ears once again. James glanced over his shoulder, his expression darkening. "You need to go," he said quietly. "Now." Miriam opened her mouth to protest, but the look in James's eyes stopped her. There was something in his gaze, something cold, something dangerous. Without another word, Miriam turned and hurried back down the street, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached her house, she glanced back at the garage. The door was closed once again, and the night was eerily silent. But Miriam knew she couldn't let this go. Something was terribly wrong, and she wasn't going to stop until she found out what. That night, as she lay in bed, Miriam made a promise to herself. She would uncover the truth about James Donovan and the girl. No matter what it took, no matter the risks, she would get to the bottom of this mystery. Because somewhere, deep down, she knew that the girl's life depended on it. Unveiling the shadows. The next few days were a blur for Miriam, filled with restless nights and uneasy thoughts. James Donovan's cold gaze lingered in her mind like an unsolved riddle. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the haunted expression of the girl, her soft sobs echoing in her memory. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The deeper she thought about it, the clearer it became. There was more to this than she could have ever imagined. Abigail, true to her word, had tried to gather information from her usual sources: neighbors, shopkeepers, and longtime residents of Maple Street. But even she came up short. James Donovan had always been a bit of a recluse, even before his wife's death. But now it seemed like no one really knew anything about him. There was no mention of a young girl in his life, no record of adoption, guardianship, or even distant relatives. The more they looked into it, the more the puzzle grew. One afternoon, as Miriam sat at her kitchen table, the weight of her worry pressing down on her, she heard a soft knock at her front door. Startled, she quickly rose and peeked through the window. To her surprise, Abigail stood on the porch, her expression unusually somber. Miriam opened the door, inviting her in. "Abby, come in. Did you find something?" Abigail entered, her lips pressed into a thin line as she settled into the nearest chair. "Miriam, something's not right. I've been asking around, discreetly of course, and, well, no one knows anything about that girl. I even called a friend of mine who works in the county's child services office, and there's no record of a missing or fostered child fitting her description. It's like she doesn't exist." Miriam felt a chill run down her spine. "That can't be. She's real. I've seen her with my own eyes, Abby. She's there every night with him. At that garage. What is James doing with her?" Abigail shook her head, her face etched with concern. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not good. You said you heard her crying, right? If she's in danger, we need to act. But we can't just go barging in. We need proof. Something solid, something that will hold up when we report this to the authorities." Miriam nodded, though her mind was already racing with the possibilities. Proof. They needed proof. But how could they get it? Breaking into the garage would be illegal. And James was sharp. He'd know if someone was snooping around. Still, Miriam couldn't bear the thought of that little girl being trapped in some horrible situation, night after night, with no one to help her. An idea slowly began to form in Miriam's mind. It was risky, but she knew it was their best shot. "Abby," she said cautiously, what if I follow him? See where he goes with her. Maybe there's something happening away from the garage, something we don't know about. If I can catch him in the act of whatever it is he's doing, we'll have the proof we need." Abigail's eyes widened in alarm. "Follow him. Miriam, that's dangerous. James isn't some harmless old man. He's secretive for a reason, and if he finds out you're tailing him—" Miriam swallowed hard, knowing full well the risks, but her instincts were screaming at her that something terrible was happening, and if no one acted, it could be too late. "I know it's dangerous, but what choice do we have? I can't just sit here and wait. What if something awful happens to that girl? I can't live with that on my conscience." Abigail studied her for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "If you're really going to do this, I won't stop you. But at least be careful. Promise me you'll be smart about it." "I promise," Miriam said, though her mind was already made up. She would follow James Donovan and get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter the cost. That night, Miriam waited by her window, her heart pounding with anticipation. The black car pulled up just as it had on every other night. James stepped out, looking as composed and controlled as ever. The girl followed him closely, her head down, her tiny frame cloaked in a jacket too large for her. The sight made Miriam's chest ache with sorrow. She couldn't let this go on any longer. As soon as they disappeared into the garage, Miriam slipped out of her house, moving as quietly as she could. She knew that James usually stayed inside the garage for a few minutes before heading back to his car, so she had to be fast. She crouched behind a hedge, waiting. The moments dragged on, the silence amplifying her nerves. Finally, the garage door creaked open, and she saw James leading the girl back to the car. He glanced around, as if sensing something was amiss, but then he got in and drove off. Miriam quickly darted to her own car, parked discreetly a few blocks away. She started the engine, making sure to keep her headlights off as she followed them at a safe distance. James's car wound its way through the narrow streets of their quiet town, past houses that had long since fallen into slumber. The farther they drove, the more anxious Miriam became. He wasn't heading toward the town center, where most businesses and homes were located. Instead, he was driving toward the outskirts, where the streets were dark and the buildings sparse. Miriam's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she wondered what lay ahead. After nearly 20 minutes of driving, the black car finally pulled into the parking lot of an old, run-down building. It looked like it had once been a factory, but now it was little more than a decaying shell. The windows were boarded up, and graffiti covered the walls. The place looked abandoned, but there was a faint light coming from inside. Miriam parked a few yards away, her heart hammering in her chest. She watched as James, and the girl got out of the car and headed toward the building. They slipped inside through a side door, the light swallowing them up. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. What was this place? Why had James brought the girl here? She knew she couldn't stay hidden in the car. She needed to see what was happening inside. Summoning all her courage, she got out and crept toward the building, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. When she reached the side door, she pressed her ear against the cold metal, straining to hear anything from within. At first, there was only silence, but then she heard voices, faint and distant, but unmistakable. One of them was James, his deep, calm tone unmistakable. The other voice, it wasn't the girl. It was someone else, another man, though Miriam couldn't make out what they were saying. Her heart raced as she realized she needed to see what was going on inside. She carefully turned the doorknob, praying it wouldn't creak, and slipped into the darkened hallway. The building smelled of dust and decay, the air thick with neglect. She followed the sound of the voices, moving as quietly as possible. As she approached the room where the light was coming from, she could hear the conversation more clearly. James was talking to the other man, his tone low and serious. "We can't keep this up much longer," the man said, his voice tense. "It's too risky. Someone's going to notice." James's response was calm, almost dismissive. "No one's noticed yet. We have time." Miriam edged closer, peeking through the crack in the door. Inside the room, she could see James standing with a tall, thin man whose face was shadowed by the dim light. The girl was sitting in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked scared, her eyes wide and unblinking. Miriam's stomach twisted with dread. What were they planning? What had they done to that poor child? Just as she was about to take another step forward, the floor beneath her creaked loudly. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The two men stopped talking immediately, their heads snapping toward the door. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then James spoke, his voice cold and sharp. "Who's there?" Miriam's breath hitched in her throat. She had been caught. The revelation had begun, but Miriam was nowhere near ready for what was about to unfold. As she stood there, paralyzed by fear, she realized that the secret she had been chasing might be far darker than she could have ever imagined. The darkness within. Miriam's mind raced. Her body screamed for her to run, to flee before she was seen, but her feet were rooted in place as if the weight of what she had overheard anchored her to the spot. She held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it through the door. James Donovan's voice pierced the air again, more forceful this time. "I said, who's there?" Miriam's heart felt like it stopped. She forced herself to remain completely still, hoping against hope that the darkness would hide her, that they would dismiss the noise as a product of the crumbling building. For a brief, excruciating moment, silence returned to the room. The tension was thick, and Miriam could feel the sweat beading on her forehead. Then the other man spoke, his voice carrying a hint of suspicion. "You're getting paranoid, Donovan. Probably just the rats in this dump." James didn't respond immediately. Miriam dared to peek through the crack in the door again, praying that they hadn't decided to investigate. She saw James take a slow, calculated breath, his sharp eyes scanning the room. After a tense moment, he gave a slight nod, relaxing a fraction. "Perhaps you're right," he finally muttered, though his tone was still guarded. "But let's wrap this up quickly. I don't want to linger any longer than necessary." The tall, thin man, whose face remained half hidden in shadow, seemed relieved. He glanced briefly at the girl in the corner, then turned back to James. "You know what we're risking here, if anyone finds out what we're doing." "They won't," James interrupted, his voice cold and absolute. "As long as you follow my instructions, no one will know. We've come too far to back out now." The other man shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't argue. Miriam's pulse raced. What were they involved in? And how was that poor girl connected to it? She couldn't just stand there and let whatever was happening continue. but she had no idea how to act without getting caught. The fact that the other man had mentioned the risks they were taking filled her with dread. Whatever they were doing was illegal, perhaps even dangerous. But what was it? Child trafficking, exploitation. Her mind filled with terrible possibilities. Just as Miriam was trying to figure out her next move, the girl in the corner whimpered softly, drawing both men's attention. She looked small and fragile in the dim light, her eyes wide with fear. The sight sent a wave of protectiveness through Miriam. She had to do something. She couldn't leave the girl in their hands, not knowing what they might do next. The thin man stepped closer to the girl, his face coming fully into view for the first time. His gaunt features were twisted with impatience, and there was something unnerving about the way he looked at the child. "Keep quiet," he hissed. "You're already causing enough trouble." The girl flinched, her body recoiling as though she had been struck. Miriam clenched her fists, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to burst into the room and stop them, but she was alone and unarmed. Confronting them head-on wasn't an option. She would only put herself in danger, and possibly the girl too. She needed to get help. But how? Calling the police wasn't possible. There was no cell service in this remote part of town, and even if she ran back to her car, by the time she reached a signal, it might be too late. Yet, if she stayed any longer, they might catch her. Miriam's mind whirled as she considered her options. Then, an idea hit her like a bolt of lightning. The camera. She had brought her phone, and if she could capture some of the conversation, or even record the men's faces, it might be enough evidence to bring to the police later. She could expose whatever twisted scheme they were involved in and rescue the girl. With trembling hands, she slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She knew she had to be careful. The faint light from the screen could easily give her away. She turned the brightness down as low as it would go and activated the camera, angling the lens toward the crack in the door. As the recording started, she heard the thin man speak again, his voice filled with frustration. "She's too fragile, Donovan. I don't care how much they're paying. You've got to find another way." "They're not paying for another way," James replied icily. "You know the terms. You knew what you were getting into when you agreed to this. Now stop complaining and do your part." Miriam's blood ran cold. They're paying. Was this some kind of black market operation? Human trafficking? Her mind raced with horrified possibilities. The way James spoke, calm, calculated, emotionless, made her skin crawl. He was running this operation like a business transaction, with no regard for the lives he was destroying. The girl let out another small whimper, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. Her tiny form seemed to shrink further into the corner, her fear palpable. Miriam's hands shook as she continued to record, her heart breaking for the child. She had to act soon. She couldn't let this go on for another minute. But just as Miriam was deciding whether to retreat and find help or confront the men, something unexpected happened. The thin man took a step closer to James, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Miriam strained to hear, her phone barely picking up their conversation. This isn't what we agreed on, Donovan. I was fine with moving the merchandise. But this is too far. This girl's different. I didn't sign up for this." James's gaze darkened, his voice dangerously low. "You knew exactly what you signed up for. Don't get cold feet now. If you want out, fine. But remember, loose ends aren't tolerated in this business." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. These men were ruthless, and they had no qualms about silencing anyone who got in their way. The thin man hesitated, his eyes flickering with fear. But then, to Miriam's surprise, he glanced at the girl again, and for the briefest moment, his expression softened. "She's just a kid, James." James's response was immediate and chilling. "She's an asset. That's all you need to remember. Now, get it done." Miriam's stomach turned. An asset? Was that all this poor girl was to them? a commodity to be used and discarded. Her resolve hardened. She couldn't leave without doing something. She had the recording, but now she needed to find a way to get the girl out of there, even if it meant risking her own safety. Just as Miriam was about to pull back and plan her escape, she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. She whipped around, only to come face to face with another man, one she hadn't seen before. He was large, broad-shouldered, and his eyes narrowed in suspicion as he took in her presence. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. Panic surged through Miriam. She had been caught. Time seemed to freeze. Miriam's mind raced, her body rigid with fear as the man loomed over her, his gaze cold and unforgiving. She knew she had mere seconds to think of something, anything, before this situation spiraled completely out of control. The darkness she had stumbled into had claws, and now they were reaching for her, caught in the shadows. Miriam's heart pounded violently in her chest, her pulse loud in her ears. The burly man who had discovered her was blocking the only exit. His frame filled the narrow doorway, his eyes sharp with suspicion and the barest hint of malice. There was no way to slip past him without raising an alarm. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a believable story that might save her, but the truth hung heavy in the air between them. She had been caught eavesdropping, spying on a dangerous secret, and from the look on his face, the man knew it too. "Who the hell are you?" he repeated, his voice lower now, a growl of warning. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Miriam felt her breath hitch. She could feel the walls closing in on her, her body trembling with the weight of fear. This wasn't a confrontation she could talk her way out of easily. She had recorded everything, damning evidence against these men. But now it was all meaningless if she couldn't escape. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, forcing herself to speak. I was just lost," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to intrude. I thought this place was abandoned, and Don't play dumb with me." The man cut her off, his voice sharp. His eyes flicked down to the phone in her hand, his expression darkening. "What's on the phone?" He stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "Give it here." Panic surged through Miriam, and instinctively, she clutched the phone tighter. She had just recorded incriminating evidence against James Donovan and his sinister operation. If this man got his hands on her phone, not only would they destroy the recording, but her own life might be forfeit. "Give it to me." His voice rose, and without warning, he lunged for her. Miriam's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She darted back, narrowly avoiding his grasp, her pulse skyrocketing. She had to get away, but the narrow hallway offered little room to maneuver, and the only escape route was blocked by the man who now wore a snarl of anger on his face. "I won't ask again." His patience snapped, and he reached out again, this time with more force, grabbing her arm with a grip like iron. Pain shot through her wrist as he yanked her closer. She struggled, trying to twist out of his grasp, but he was far stronger than she was. Her heart raced with fear, but deep down, something more primal ignited in her, a surge of defiance. She couldn't let them take her, and she couldn't let them erase the truth she had just uncovered. In a burst of desperation, Miriam used her free hand to slam the side of her phone against his arm. The sudden, sharp movement startled him just enough for his grip to loosen. She wrenched her arm free and bolted, racing down the hallway with her heart in her throat. "Get back here." The man roared behind her, his footsteps pounding the floor in pursuit. Miriam's mind was a blur. She sprinted through the dim corridor, trying to remember the layout of the building. It was a maze of abandoned rooms and debris-filled halls. But there had to be an exit. There had to be a way out. Her legs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned a corner sharply, only to find herself facing a dead end. A door, locked, blocked her path, and her eyes darted around the room frantically, searching for another way out. Behind her, she could hear the man closing in, his heavy footsteps growing louder, closer. Her mind raced through her options. There were no windows, no vents large enough to crawl through. The door was thick and old, unlikely to break with a single shove. Trapped, the cold realization washed over her, but then her eyes landed on a large wooden crate in the corner, partially covered with dust and cobwebs. Without thinking, she dove behind it, crouching low and holding her breath as she heard the man turn the corner. His footsteps slowed, the sound of his boots echoing off the walls as he came to a stop. Miriam. His voice was mocking now, dripping with menace. Come out, wherever you are." Miriam bit her lip to keep from gasping, her body trembling as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows. She didn't dare move. She could hear the man's breathing, heavy and deliberate, as if he were savoring the hunt. He knew she was trapped, and now he was enjoying the game, taking his time to flush her out. The seconds dragged on, agonizingly slow. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, her chest aching from holding her breath. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere to go. All she could do was pray that the darkness and the clutter would conceal her long enough for him to give up. "Come on, don't make this harder on yourself." His voice was closer now. She could hear the scrape of his boots against the floor, mere feet away. "You're not going anywhere. Hand over the phone, and maybe I won't have to hurt you." Her grip tightened on the phone. She had no intention of giving it up. This was her only leverage, the only thing that could expose the truth. But as the man's footsteps approached, she knew she was running out of time. He would find her soon. And when he did, there was no telling what he might do. Just then, the distant sound of a door slamming echoed through the hallway, followed by muffled voices. The man froze, his head snapping toward the noise. Miriam felt her breath catch. There were others, James Donovan, the thin man, and the girl. Had they heard the commotion? But she couldn't leave without the girl. Her conscience screamed at her to act. She had heard too much, seen too much, and that poor child was still trapped with them, caught in a web of darkness and deceit. Miriam steeled herself, taking a deep breath. She had made it this far. She couldn't turn back now. She wiped the sweat from her brow and began to move again, this time with renewed determination. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. If she didn't find the girl soon, it might be too late for both of them. With quiet, deliberate steps, she made her way back down the hallway, her heart racing with a mix of fear and resolve. She had to rescue the girl, and she had to do it now. The escape plan. Miriam's breath came in shallow gasps as she moved through the dimly lit corridors of the abandoned garage, her footsteps barely audible against the dusty floor. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run as far away as she could from the dark secrets she had uncovered. But she knew she couldn't leave, not without the girl. The image of her small, frightened face was burned into Miriam's mind, her wide eyes silently pleading for help. As she navigated the labyrinth of decaying hallways, her mind raced through what she had overheard. The girl wasn't just another unfortunate victim. She was the centerpiece of something far bigger, a scheme that involved people in power, money, and something even more insidious. James Donovan was playing a dangerous game, and the girl was at the heart of it all. Miriam's fingers tightened around her phone, the weight of the evidence she had recorded pressing on her like a physical burden. She had proof that could bring Donovan's entire operation crashing down. But it would mean nothing if she couldn't get out alive, and more importantly, if she couldn't save the girl. She turned a corner cautiously, her senses heightened, alert to every sound. The building was vast and neglected, but she knew she had to be getting close. The basement, where they were keeping the girl, was nearby. Her pulse quickened with the realization that this was the moment. Either she would succeed, or everything would fall apart. As she descended the staircase to the basement, the air grew heavier, the musty smell of neglect mixing with something more sinister. It was colder down here, the damp walls seeming to press in on her. But she pushed the fear down, forcing herself to focus. There was no room for hesitation now. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused, listening carefully. Voices echoed faintly from a room down the hall. Donovan's voice was unmistakable, low, commanding, with an edge of frustration. He was talking to the thin man, and though she couldn't make out the exact words, she could hear the tension in their conversation. Something had changed, and Donovan wasn't happy about it. Miriam crept closer, moving from shadow to shadow, her body pressed against the cold, damp walls. The voices grew clearer as she neared the door. "You should have found her by now," Donovan was saying, his tone sharp with impatience. "We can't risk her escaping. Not with what she knows." "I'm working on it," the thin man replied, his voice carrying an edge of anxiety. "But she's slippery. We'll catch her. I've already sent the others to search the building." "Not good enough," Donovan snapped. "This whole operation is at risk because of one snooping girl. If she gets out with anything, we're finished. You understand that, right?" There was a pause, and Miriam could almost hear the thin man swallow nervously. "I get it, but we got her cornered. She won't." "Don't tell me what she won't do," Donovan interrupted, his voice rising. "She's already done more than I thought possible. Just find her and make sure she doesn't leave this place alive." Miriam felt a chill run down her spine. They were hunting her, and they were desperate. She had no illusions about what would happen if they caught her, but she didn't have time to dwell on that now. Her focus shifted to the girl. She had to get her out before it was too late. Just as she was about to move again, the door to the room creaked open, and the thin man stepped out into the hallway. Miriam quickly ducked into the nearest doorway, pressing herself flat against the wall. The man's footsteps echoed down the corridor as he headed in the opposite direction. She waited until the sound faded before slipping out of her hiding spot. Now was her chance. She approached the room carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was slightly ajar, and she peered through the crack, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the girl. There in the corner, huddled against a stack of crates, was the small figure of the child. Her hands were bound, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes were alert, watching the door, waiting for whatever fate was to come. Miriam's chest tightened with both anger and determination. She couldn't leave her here. She had to act fast. She pushed the door open quietly and slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The girl's eyes widened in surprise as Miriam approached, but she didn't make a sound. She had learned, by now, not to cry out, not to scream. Her silence was heartbreaking. "It's okay," Miriam whispered, kneeling beside her and pulling a small pocket knife from her jacket. "I'm here to help. We're getting out of here." The girl's gaze flickered with hope, though she still trembled with fear. Miriam worked quickly, sawing through the rough ropes that bound the girl's wrists and ankles. As soon as the last of the bindings fell away, the girl moved to stand, but her legs were weak from being tied for so long. Miriam caught her before she could fall, her grip firm but gentle. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice soothing. "Just hold on a little longer. We're almost out." The girl nodded, her small hand clutching Miriam's arm as if it were a lifeline. Miriam helped her to her feet, but before they could move, they both froze. Footsteps echoed down the hallway again, this time heavier, more deliberate. Donovan was coming. Miriam's heart raced. There was no time to think. She scanned the room for another way out and spotted a ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It was small, but just large enough for the girl to crawl through. It might be their only chance. "Can you climb?" Miriam asked urgently. The girl hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, her face set with determination. Miriam helped her up, lifting her toward the vent and quickly removing the grate. The girl slipped inside, her body disappearing into the darkness of the ventilation shaft. "I'll be right behind you," Miriam whispered, though she knew the truth. She couldn't fit through the vent herself, but as long as the girl was safe, it didn't matter. The footsteps grew louder, closer. There was no more time. Miriam replaced the grate as quietly as she could, then moved to the far side of the room, where she crouched behind a stack of crates. Her mind raced with what little options she had left. She had to distract Donovan, buy the girl enough time to escape through the vent, and make it outside. The door to the room burst open, and Donovan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space with a predatory gleam. Miriam's heart pounded as she watched him, her body tense. She had one chance. Donovan took a step forward, his gaze narrowing as he noticed the cut ropes on the floor. "She's been here," he muttered to himself, his voice filled with frustration. He took another step toward the center of the room, and in that instant, Miriam acted. Grabbing a heavy metal pipe from the floor, she hurled it across the room, sending it crashing into the far wall with a deafening clatter. Donovan spun around, startled by the noise, his gun drawn. In that brief moment of distraction, Miriam slipped out of her hiding spot and bolted for the door. She didn't look back as she sprinted down the hallway, her heart pounding with every step. She knew Donovan would be right behind her, but all that mattered was getting far enough away for the girl to escape. She had no idea where the vent led, but she prayed it would take the girl to safety, out of this nightmare. Miriam's legs burned with the effort of running, but she didn't stop. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, but she forced herself to keep going, to push through the fear and exhaustion. She had come too far to give up now. As she reached the exit of the building, the cold night air hit her face, a rush of relief flooding through her. She had made it outside, but she wasn't safe yet. The night was still filled with danger, and Donovan was still hunting her. But the girl was free, and that, more than anything, gave Miriam the strength to keep going. She had done what she set out to do. The truth was out there, and now it was only a matter of time before Donovan's empire crumbled. As she disappeared into the shadows, Miriam allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The battle wasn't over, but she had won this round, and she would keep fighting, no matter what it took.